Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. We're again continuing where we left off in book chapter 8 and book 4, chapter 8, which continues the question of the regimes not yet discussed. So, what are the regimes left not discussed? The argument was there was four, but then there was five. There was four so-called kingship. Oligarchy, democracy, and then last but not least, so-called aristocracy. We had this discussion, and then he says the fifth is this thing called the regime that's common to all names, regime called regime. What ends up happening is a discussion of all aristocracy, what is aristocratically run. It becomes a problem of what is aristocracy. So, and therefore, and technically, we look at chapter 7 and say that was aristocracy. Now, we're going to have a discussion about regime. He says right here. Again, remember the translation. Lord and many other people will translate it as polity. This is not, the word is politeia, so it's regime. So if we keep the regime, if we keep it the original one, we can see the contradictions, we see the fun of the text, and we see maybe the deeper meaning of what's being said here. For what it remains for us to speak of what is termed regime, as well as of tyranny. So we have to talk not just one thing. Now he mentions the other regime that was mentioned before is monarchy. Now he switches from being monarchy to tyranny. It's interesting in that sense. So he switches again. So that the original four was, remember, kingship, oligarchy, democracy, so-called aristocracy. Then there's really discussion of what does aristocracy really mean. Much of chapter 7 is about aristocracy, what it means, and what it really meant, versus the deviation. Then what he then suggests as three, but the three really become two. And that the two, what is said, the middle one is said to be, basically Sparta and Carthage, but then it contradicts what he says about them in book 2. And whereas they're more critical oligarchic, and what defines oligarchic is this tending towards being oligarchy, right? A regime that tends towards oligarchy, right? We're inclined to a so-called regime that is inclined to oligarchy. And that is what so-called regime aristocracies are, really. That they're a regime that is told. Now we're going to speak about polity, but also tyranny. Regime called regime. We're going to talk about what is termed regime as well as tyranny. So we're talking about regime and tyranny. We have arranged it thus: although regime is not a deviation, nor are those sorts of aristocracies just spoken of. But sorts of aristocracies are not deviations either, but they are deviations. What's going on here? Okay, this is because in truth, all short for. So therefore, this regime called regime also falls short of the most correct regime. So these regimes, these aristocracies that are spoken of, which are really the things that are called aristocracies, that are inclined towards better things, right? Which we talked about in last chapter. All regimes fall short of the best regime, of the correct one. All fall short of the most correct regime. And because because usually it is enumerated with them are those which are themselves deviations from them, which we said in our initial discourses. Again, this is 37. This is, again, usually referred to book 3, chapter 7, right? This is the typology of regimes. But a reference seems to be also for 2. Again, that's the same thing. This is the other thing. We have to remember that the original position of regimes is presented at 3.7, which, remember, the 3.7 typology of the qualitative claim, which is self-interest or ruler's interest, and then the quantitative claim, one too many. The quantitative claim disappears. In the next chapter, the typology collapses. It doesn't hold water in that sense. The second time it was brought up, it's then at 4 chapter 2, it's returned again to, but then it's immediately dismissed and we put it aside. Now it also kind of collapses also because what happens is that he in the next chapter he suggests that oligarchy is more about wealth and about number, so therefore it throws apart the typology again. So let's think about this for a second. What's going on here? So the eternal discourses. Okay, the other things earlier we've said earlier in other parts. It's either chapter 7 of book 3 or chapter 2 book 4. Both of these things are dismissed. One is deconstructed, it falls apart. A new conception of argumentation of regime is presented, and here this is another thing. It's set aside, and also then later it implicitly falls apart in the next chapter of what is and why it's set aside in that sense, right? So now he says it's reasonable to make mention of tyranny since all of them this is the least of regime. So tyranny is the least of a regime. Of all politeia, this is the least of the politeia. While our inquiry concerning the regime, while our inquiry concerns the regime. So therefore, we're concerned with the regime. So tyranny is the least. Remember, again, this is because tyranny is pure despotic rule. It's pure coercive. It's ruling masterly. It's ruling coercively. It is pure masterly in that sense. Despotic. It's despotic in that sense. It's pure despotic rule. So this is, and therefore, it is therefore least political, and therefore it's least of a regime, right? The reason it has been arranged in this manner, then, has been spoken of, and now we must set out our view of regime. The manner we've done this on this, we've set up why we're going to do it this way because of the four. We're dealing with what's remaining, and now we have to talk about regime. We talked about so-called aristocracy. Now we're going to talk about regime, but we haven't talked about kingship. Well, tyranny is not. We're not going to talk about tyranny because it's. But what about monarchy? What about monarchy? There's silence about monarchy. So let's continue there. What it says. It is reasonable to mention tyranny, right? But it's the least of all regimes. And our car is about regimes, so we're not going to talk about tyranny. But the above discussion talk about monarchy, not tyranny. So he substitutes tyranny for monarchy. And what does he do now? He now says what? He says, um, the reason why it has been arranged in this manner is such the case with politics. And its capacity should be more evident now, as we have discussed what pertains to oligarchy and democracy. So, because our discussion of regime now is more pertinent because of what we've already said about oligarchy and democracy. What do we say? Now, remember, this is that weird thing. Remember that the second democracy in the first account, and which is the first democracy in the first democracy in chapter 4 becomes the first democracy, the second democracy. The second democracy, there's everyone participate, everyone own. There's a property qualification, right? This is the property qualification criteria, the second one, but it's democratic still, right? And this echoes the first in chapter 6, right? This and the first oligarchy in both accounts are very similar. So these this regime? Is this what the regime is in a way? Because all regimes are, again, remember the city is a composite of parts. So therefore the regime is the ordering of those parts. So therefore all regimes are mixed regimes. That, in other words, that all regimes is mixing of the parts. There's going to be a blending of the parts, and therefore deciding what part is the ruling part. And there's all going to be blending. All regimes blend the different parts. So therefore, this idea that the mixed regime, the so-called regime called regime, is the mixed regime, nonsense. All regimes are mixed because the political world is a composite of aggregation of parts, not a whole. The regime becomes kind of like a whole, and it seeks to speak authoritatively for the whole. This is how the parts and the whole relate to each other, right? This is what the whole point of book 3 is: this play between the parts and the whole and how they relate and how the polis. This is a whole question of the politics. How does the parts relate to the whole, right? Now we have a problem here because we get this weird discussion of its capacity should be more evident now since we've discussed this. Speaking simply, a regime is a mixture of oligarchy and democracy. Yeah. It is customary, however, to call regimes those sort which tend towards democracy and those tending towards oligarchy aristocracies, on account of the fact that education and good birth particularly accompany those who are better off. So, one type of regime where the people will tend towards democracy, and the other one is going to be that's. But how does that not differ from the so-called aristocracy I already mentioned? The fourth, the third kind of aristocracy that really collapses because the second one kind of really disappears. The second one becomes really the third, and therefore the first and the third remain. The first is not going to be discussed. Only the third. Voila! We get the same problem here. The two, but not two. The second one is really an aristocracy, a so-called aristocracy. Okay. So what's happening here? This regime is a mixture. All regimes are mixtures. So there's nothing unique about this regime. The regime is a mixture of all the. This is like water is wet. Water is wet. Fire is hot. um, the sky is blue. Okay, that's white and black now. I mean, this is an A equals A statement. That's like a tautology almost, right? Um, that the regime is a mixture of oligarchy and democracy. Yes, of course, the regime is a mixture of oligarchy and democracy because it's an aggregation. So why is he doing this? That's the question. Why is he? Why does he feel obligated? Is it because there is a kind of attitude of a certain type of democracy? That there's a problem with that Plato so defines democracy, that the philosophic mind has so defined democracy as a presented republic, and it associates democracy with the last democracy, that the name democracy itself has become a bad reputation. It's one argument. So, but let's continue here. Let's go look at this, right? The idea that the better, in other words, there's a presupposition here that on account of the fact that education and good birth particularly accompany those who are better off. This is a presupposition of this so-called aristocracy. Okay, so that's a presupposition that well should rule, that good birth should rule. That's a presupposition, again echoing the discussion in three. The whole point of the argument in 310, right? Remember what he said in book 310 about the claims of the debate about the various these presuppositions about claims of justice. Who should rule? This is a presupposition, not the truth. Further, those who are well off are held to possess things, or possess already the things for which the unjust commit injustice. Okay, again, do the unjust is this assumes that people commit crimes because of lack of wealth, poverty. They might, but it's not the only reason for injustice, right? So therefore, they're more just because they have wealth. Again, this is a oligarchic presumption, right? This is why they referred to as gentlemen and notables. Okay, the notables again, good eye that where he goes, and this is kind of the rich, respectable types, right? The gentlemen are the noble and good men, the good and noble men, the kalos agathos. They're referred to as the kalos agathos, the good and beautiful men. Okay, they are referred to the good and beautiful men and the junos, I mean, those those better types. All right, okay. Since aristocracy tries to, again, this is interesting. We're supposed to be talking about regime called regime, but he spends most of his time again talking about aristocracy, right? Again, all right? Since aristocracy tries to assign preeminence to the best citizens, it is asserted that the oligarchies are too made up of particular gentlemen. So wait a minute. This is preeminence towards the best citizens, but it is asserted that oligarchies too are made up of particular gentlemen. So they're both gentlemen. So this kind of muddies the water, doesn't it? Also, it is held to be impossible for a city to have good governance, unomia, if it is run not aristocratically but by the base. So if it's if it's not run aristocratically by the best, but rather by the base, it's not going to have good governance. Again, this is a kind of an argument about wealth, right? Good persons. And simultaneously, if for one, and similarly, for one that does not have good governance to be and for one that does not have good governance to be aristocratic. It's a tautology. The argument here is a tautology that it's impossible for it's impossible for a city to have a good government if it's not aristocratically won, and similarly for one that does not have good governments to be aristocratically. You can't, in other words, if you're not aristocratic, you can't have good governance. And if you don't have good governments, you're not going to have aristocratic. Okay, so that's a tautology again, right? That's my assumption of this, right? It's um, it's impossible for a city to have good governments if it is not one aristocracy, and and it's not to have good governance. It's impossible for it to not have good governments if it is aristocracy. Do you understand? So therefore, it's A equals. This is a kind of wired tautology in the argument, but it's an interesting one because it ties the idea of good governments with aristocracy. Well, what does aristocracy mean? Best rule. But we've argued even in book one, the best rule is the rule by what? The common, all rule that rules for the best is the rule for the common advantage. So the one who rules well is ruling for the best. So therefore, all regimes that technically rule for the common advantage, they are the best rule. So the aristocratic rule means the rule of the best, nothing more. That's what it means. Rule of the best, aristocratic. So therefore, again, there's kind of like it falling apart. What is meant by the aristocratic in that sense? It's the rule of the best. But the rule of the best really just means that you're ruling for the common advantage. So as long as the rulers are ruling for the common advantage, and that's aristocratic, that's rule of the best. But wait a minute, didn't we say? Now remember, this goes back to that question in book 10: is aristocratic mean the rule of the best or the best one's ruling? If it's the former, then it doesn't matter whether one, few, or many, as long as it doesn't matter that they are good. They're ruling in the sense that they produce the common benefit, then they're ruling well. If they're ruling out, of course, democracy, the rule of the many and the rule of the rich, the poor and the rich are going to may pursue their own interests rather than the interest of everyone. That's why these regimes. It's when the regime cares more for its own interests, the ruler's interests, or its sake of control. then it violates the common good. It violates the collective advantage. And it rules not for the collective advantage, but it rules for merely for its own interest, for its own sake. That's partisan rule. So let's go through this here. So for this whole thing about good governance, about the question of good governance. What is good governance? Good governance is ruling for the common good or the common advantage. Not the opposite of good governance is ruling for the ruler's own interest against the common advantage or ruling against the common advantage. Now, because for good governance does not exist where the laws have been well enacted yet are not obeyed. Ooh, that's a very interesting one. That is a that you may have good laws, you might have well good laws, but they're not obeyed. You can't have good governance. The law must be authoritative. The problem here is this is going to talk about later in chapter 11, I think, about why the poor and the rich disobey the law. The rich through their arrogance, and the poor because of their their lack. Right? Again, that's the point he makes up here. That poor can't be trusted because they lack. They'll steal. They don't have leisure to be virtuous. This is true, but um, we have to remember that whole discussion of Book 6 of how wealth corrupts the city, both in terms of democracy and the oligarchy, right? It's the excessive wealth that corrupts in chapter 6 of this, and that leads to the collapse to both the two tyrannical forms of democracy and oligarchy. The last democracy and the last oligarchy is because of excessive wealth in chapter 6. Here, what's happening here is that when law is not obeyed, this is when good governance is not possible, right? And it doesn't matter if you may have good laws, you might have finely established laws, but if the people don't obey them, they're not following them, they're not governed by them, then doesn't matter. They're not obeyed. Hence, one should conceive it to be one sort of good governments when the laws are obeyed as enacted, and another the sort when the laws are being upheld have been finally, in other words, but another sort when the laws being upheld have been finally enacted. For it is possible that even badly enacted ones will be obeyed. So therefore, this is like this idea that there's this weird thing about this. Let's go look at this for a second. I want to just go back. That hence it should conceive as the sort of governance, right? And yet another word like this upheld, and another, in other words, that one should conceive it a good sort of governance when the laws are obeyed as enacted, and another when the laws being upheld have been finally enacted. In other words, they're going to ignore some laws, but those are the bad ones, right? This is the possibility that even bad actions can be obeyed. So therefore, there's may be some we're going to only uphold the good laws, the finally enacted ones. We're going to not uphold the bad laws. So there's two types of good governance. There's the opponents of the laws, with the upholding with the laws, the good finally enacted laws that we uphold. And then what? So there's not only some mere obedience of law, but mere obedience of good laws. Okay, that's the even more interesting point about this, right? This continues here. This may be done in two ways. They may obey either the laws that are the best of those possible for them, or those that are best simply. So there's two questions. You can accomplish this by two things: what is best for them versus what is best simply. But what happens if what's best simply is not best for them? That's a problem. What happens if the best simply is not possible for our people? Then you should do the second, right? That's the whole point. That you should try to achieve the best. This is the practical point of our politics here. This is why these two goals are there. It's the yes, we should try the best, but if you can't get the first, you try the second. Well, but isn't that what the polity is? Polity is the second best. It's not second best. It's what the best that is possible. And given what he said earlier, that all regimes fall short of the best regime, then maybe the simply best may not be possible in that sense or feasible. And it may not actually be the best regime in reality. If given that all will fall short, we think it's the well, we may, in other words, do we know it's the what the best is? Well, no, we can only enact the best regime if we know what really the best is. The argument that the best is the best, well, that's a tautology. That's not a specific claim. So, what view of justice is the best? Now, the argument we have one: rule for the common advantage. That is just rule. That's eudaimonia. But that's not that difficult to get to. That's not really a high standard. If eunomia is and that this is what the common advantage is, and this is good governance, or good governance is doing it justly. This is justice also. That for the political view that the advantages for the common advantage. This may be more attainable than the argument for the best is. So therefore, the best possible may be the best way to get to the best simply. So that's why maybe thinking this through a little bit, you see the complexity of what's going on here. Now it continues, right? Aristocracy is, again, we'll supposed to be talking about polity, or the so-called regime called regime, but instead we talk about aristocracy again. Aristocracy is held most particularly the distribution of prerogatives on the basis of virtue. Again, prerogative on the basis of virtue. For defining principle, aristocracy is virtue, right? That of oligarchy, wealth, and that of the rule of the people, freedom. Again, this repeats book 3, chapter 10 thing, right? The principle of what the major part resolves is permitted in all. In oligarchy and aristocracy, or in regimes ruled by the people, what is resolved by the greatest part of those taking part in the regime is authoritative. Now, this is a very important part. This is the logic of all regimes. The principle, the thing that what the major part resolves, is present in all. Right? In oligarchy, in aristocracy, in the regime ruled by the people, and regimes ruled by the people, or not democracy, but regimes ruled by the people. It, what is resolved by the greatest part of those taking part in the regime, majority, it rules. So therefore, in the oligarchy, it's the wealthy who partake in the part. In aristocracy, the better born. And in the popular regimes or ruled by the people, it's the people. And therefore, the majority of each, the majority here wins, the majority here wins, and the majority. These are what it's authoritative, right? So this is a general principle of this, right? Now, in most cities, the kind of regime that is commonly called aristocracy is not correctly called. The kind, this is 38. This is a weird thing again. The text meaning is uncertain. The expression tu ponteas eidos kiltea is explained by Newman. This is Newman's the form which is called polity exists, but it's hardly clear how this allegedly nomadic sense of Kleinian helps the sense of the larger context. Others have suggested a variety of uninations, none are satisfying. I believe something is dropped out of the text and supply what I take in the meaning of this. So literally means, this is that weird line here. In other words, now in most cities, the kind of regime called. Now, in most cities, call this kind of regime. Or, in other words, this idea may be that this is what I would think. Okay, this is what I would interpret this to mean. That therefore, this good principle here, right, which is authoritative Lun. Now, in most cities, this the kind of regime that's talked about here is called regime. or he says commonly called aristocracy, right? But no, this is why it's weird. This is why there's something missing here. So this weird sentence, we don't know what it means. For the mixture, he says the mixture aims only at the well-off and the poor, at wealth and freedom, since in most places the well-off are held to occupy the place of gentlemen. So therefore, this is the idea of the oligarch, the well-off of the gentleman. The assumption is this: the gentleman, the good and noble. It's gentleman is literally the good and noble or beautiful, right? The good and beautiful ones. Okay, the good and noble ones. The kaloi, beautiful or good, fine, or and good together, right? The good ones, the noble and good ones. They are the well off. It's normally assumed. That's an oligarchic assumption, really. That's an oligarchic assumption. So whether we have the mixture aims at only at the well off and the poor, wealth and freedom. So therefore, this mixture claim here is weird in that sense. It's a balancing. It's attempt. The mixture tends to balance these two. That's what I think this is mean. The balancing. It's trying to attempt to balance these two. The mixture is always about, and this is true about any regime. All regimes are trying to balance these two principles. Have to, because these two principles are the most destructive. If either this way or this way, it ultimately, we'll see in chapter 11 how it undermines the regime. So therefore, that's what it's. I think. I think it may be correct that this is, in other words, what is commonly called aristocracy is not correctly called. It's so called. Is not correctly called democracy. Is a regime. That's just a thing. The next claim about this is about the well and poor. The thing's a mixture. Since there are three things disputed over equality in the regime. Now, this is 39. This is that weird thing of disputing of equal treatment in the regime. I think that's what is usually translated, but the reference appears to be fundamental discussion of democratic oligarch views and meaning of equality in 3.9. Again, I think this is what he's doing. I think he's trying to avoid that. In other words, since there's three disputing things over equality in a regime, freedom, wealth, and virtue. This is the things we have to debate. Are we have equal in freedom, equal in wealth, and equal in virtue? For the fourth, they call good birth, accompanies the later two, good birth and wisdom. Again, the oligarchy. But good birth can mean good citizenship too, right? Being good birth being the wealth of old wealth and virtue together. Again, this is the kind of aristocratic assumption, right? The so-called aristocracy. It is evident that a mixture of the two, the well-off and the poor, is to be spoken of as regime. Again, that's obvious. Yes, there are mixture. Of course, there's going to be a mixture in our regimes. So he's not. This idea that this is a specific type is yes, but no. While the mixture of the three should, apart from the genuine and first form, be spoken most particularly as aristocracy. What? The first form is the genuine and first form. Apart from the true aristocracy, the genuine aristocracy, and the first one, back all the way back there. Again, we have a discussion of aristocracy. That if you mix the three, mix the two, this is a regime. Okay, but if you mix the three, it's an aristocracy. But different than the first one. But let's go back for a second. Let's go back. Because I think it's funny. Got the Carthage regime. Let's go to this line right here. I think this is the point where it kind of. Look what he says here. There's three types, right? This is the Carthage is aristocratic because it has this virtue and wealth. This one. But then the Spartan, right? He says these two mixed, and then therefore the virtue And then therefore, what is this? And then they're in, and therefore two kinds of aristocracy: first and the of the first and the or the best. There's two more, and he says that the second one is the other one, right? And then the third is the regime that inclines to oligarchy. But remember, what is the regime that the second one that disappears, and that is the Spartan one, which is what? That is the Carthaginian, that ties the Spartan is that virtue in the people, right? That it's the virtue in the people, not wealth. This is this one that adds wealth, virtue, and people together. So so let's go to this point here. It's evident that this mixture of this other one, right? That there's only that if it's going to be poor and well off, that is the multitude and the people. That this is the Spartan example that he gives in the other chapter, which is the third kind of thing, not this one. But that's really the third one is really the third one because it's towards oligarchic. And this mixture of the three becomes aristocratic, like Carthage. That is again not really aristocratic, but okay. Again, I think this is why we need to look at the two chapters in relation to each other because it kind of undermines the kind of surface argument. So why does he undermine the surface argument? It's because he wants us to pay attention. I think it's maybe it's he wants us to shock our opinion, see if we've been paying attention, see if we really thought through things. And maybe this is the thing that the arrogant people who believe that they're noble born and therefore I should rule, and there's the other kind of people who believe I'm better than those mob. These are powerful people and powerful interests, and that these opinions believe that there's okay. I'm better than democracy. I'm better than the mere wealthy. Okay, these are presuppositions. They exist in the political realm, and that therefore they, but they're not really. They're more. One is more democratic, but it wants to deny it's democratic because they fear the extreme democracy, and the other one is that they are, um, they call they are oligarchic, but they think they're better than oligarchic because we're old wealth, right? Not new wealth, old wealth, right? And he goes, there are other kind of regimes apart from monarchy, democracy, oligarchy. Then has been stated, and it's evident which sort they are, and in what ways aristocracies differ from themselves and regimes from aristocracy, and that they are not far from one another. So that wait a minute, they're not far. Regimes and aristocracy are not far from each other. I argue that this is the case. I think in many ways the regime is, if it's run well, is the best regime. The rule of the best is the one that is ruled well in Udemia, and that's when the law is obeyed. Mm. Okay, you see this? This is the logic of if you thread all the arguments together, then the problem with the so-called aristocracy and the so-called regime, these are presuppositions, and there one is a kind of a running away from democracy, and the other one is a running away from oligarchy, both towards the best. You understand? So it's not really a regime because the regime is these in many ways the politeia and aristocracy are constantly converging. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. So that's another thing about these two chapters. What we're supposed to talk about one here, but in order to talk about that, you talk about it, talk about the so-called regime called regime, and then talk about the regime called regime. You always talk about aristocracy. So the, these two are always in relation to one another. These two are always tied to oligarchy and democracy. That the more oligarchic character, the one that's tied to wealth, and wealth and people is one thing, but this weird this debate between what is what. One is oligarchic that seeks to be better than oligarchy because of good birth, old wealth versus new, and the other one is the people who is run well. In other words, it's the people, but we're not going to be the worst democracy. We're not going to simply do what we want. We're going to be restrained by law. Okay, again, this is why this is it's interesting from that point of view. And they're not far from one another. Okay, so therefore, this is the problem. This is why regime is. We're back to the best regime. So that's how this chapter ends. It's a conundrum. And then we continue next chapter on the so-called polity, right? This is we thought we ended it, but we're supposed to be this is this, and then we have to have chapter 9 because it's not ended. So therefore, there's not a clear conviction. Whereas, look at the clear logic of democracy. One, we have the parts, democratic, for variety, then the oligarchic account, then the resummary 4-4. That's equal each other. We don't get a similar thing here. We get a 3 that collapse into 1, a 2 that really collapse, that 1 disappears to be best. And here we get 2, but it's really are 2, but really they're not 2, they're the same. Now we have to have another part. We get this in chapter 9, so we'll do that. If you have any questions on chapter 7, chapter 8, sorry, please give them below, and I will get to them when I see them. You have comments, things like this. Please do it there. If you liked it, like it. If you liked it, share it with a friend. Share it on your social media and get people attention. If you don't like it, say why you don't like it. Tell me. Maybe I can learn something. Another thing you can do is, if you have not subscribed already, please subscribe. Click the grow the channel. If you can know someone to share this with a friend so that you can get them to subscribe. Subscription helps because once I grow bigger, we get maybe some monetization, so I can pay. So this leads us to if you want to follow me on social media, follow me below. But this leads us to our next point. If you want to help the channel, you can do so by doing Subscribe Star or Patreon. I understand what you're going to say. Well, there's no real incentive for doing this. They're giving it anyways. You're not doing anything special. I said this all the time. If you build it and people are there and they want something, they're not going to do something. But again, I'm doing this because why am I doing? Why do I'm chilling at this level a little bit? Because this is costing me something now. Because my channel is big enough now that I have to pay extra money just to keep the channel up. This has videos. I'm going to have to, when I die, these videos may get lost because of I was hoping they'd be my last, as good as my books. These things would be up there as part of it. But now, as YouTube's doing, is they're trying to, you got to pay, and otherwise you're going to lose your, size. I hope these people, do like this, and that there's a record of this in that sense. This is why I hope that I'm doing this. This is my vain attempt at immortality. So it can help. Subscribe that if you want to. If you want to, the other means you can even send money through the. I'm not doing that really. Even I'm just saying there's ways if you want to, because I'm doing it. Okay, so another way you can help is buy the book. Buy this book. You can buy my other books, but buy this one, I get the money directly a little bit. It's Lulu publishes as a study guide. This is a kind of textbook guide, not textbook, but a study book, a workbook that helps students follow and study the politics. This is about politics, right? Aristotle's politics. It goes book by book, chapter by chapter. It gives outlines, sketches. It highlights the points. It's a guidebook to guide you through the politics. Not interpretation, not a summary. It's something that goes with the politics to help you go through it. You buy it at Lulu, I get the bigger bit of money from them. But if you buy, I understand why you're not going to buy it at Amazon because they ship you free. Same thing you got Barnes and Noble. I understand the other sellers. You have your reason why you're buying the other sellers. Okay, great. Do that. You share it with a friend who knows. Buy it for yourself. If you bought a copy, buy someone for a student. Please, this helps me. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop. We look at next time we meet. We look at chapter 9. And there, that's it. That's take care. Bye bye. Have a good day.